Okay, hey everybody, to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today I have a really cool update for you from the brand Citizen, founded back in 1918 by both Japanese and Swiss investors, eventually settling on the brand of Citizen Watch Company around 1930. Citizen Group now owns Miyota, Belova, Arnold & Son, Frederic Constant, Alpina, and Campagnola, and they also, not too long ago, actually acquired La Joux-Perret, the Swiss movement manufacturer. They're pretty much best known for their more affordable quartz offerings that you might find out within the retail space, but they also did help Seiko disrupt the Swiss watch industry during the quartz crisis of the 1970s. In terms of the type of watch, this is a dive watch. Some key characteristics and design when you're looking for a diver. Of course, you're going to want something that's tough, legible, with a dive time bezel and a dive extension is always nice if on bracelet, and you got to have that water resistance, typically through some type of screw down crown. This is the Citizen Promaster Challenge Diver, and it's a retro design based on a vintage Citizen Challenge Diver found covered in barnacles at an Australian beach after being submerged in the ocean for years and years, but was found actually still ticking away. Now, the list price on this is $9.95, but it can be had for $7.96 directly from TeddyBalthasar.com. So big shout out to the Teddy team for sending this piece in for review. Now, some of the nice things about purchasing through Teddy is that he is an authorized dealer of Citizen, so you will get that full manufacturer's warranty. Also, they do offer price matching and monthly financing options are available, as well as having a US-based customer service team, which is always nice if you do need to hit them up in the chat. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. Okay guys, so this piece for me was one that was really highly anticipated. There was a lot of hype that was building around this right before release, and slowly after release, I feel like a lot of that initial hype faded, and I think that was due to an understanding and a proposition that I think the enthusiast community was really hoping that this was going to be kind of this Seiko killer because of the spec. You're getting the titanium with the hard coating. You're getting that higher beat Miyota movement that's going to be ticking at 4 hertz versus your typical 3 hertz you'd get from a Seiko. And of course, that really nice vintage skin diver aesthetic that kind of does parallel the look of the old school Seiko 62 MAS, which was their first dive watch. And this, of course, has a very similar design language. Now, I think when it actually came out, we found that it's just in a different category. So I'll make a separate video where I do some side-by-side comparisons, but I do want to make sure to highlight this watch for what it is, which is it's actually an outstanding tool watch. It's a great dive watch. But of course, if you do compare it to some of the other offerings that are not just best in class, really class leading, I think that's where you find some of the shortcomings where I think Citizen did not necessarily position this to compete with some of those higher end Seiko offerings. So with that said, let's get into the dimensions. This has a 41 millimeter diameter. It's only 12.1 millimeters thick, which is actually quite thin, guys. So really nice from that perspective. 48.6 millimeters lug to lug, although it does have male end links, so you're going to get a little bit more protrusion for the ultimate lug to lug there. This is made out of their super titanium alloy, and it does have their Duratec hard coating, which is known for its toughness, even above that of Seiko's Dia Shield coating. Now, coming to the sapphire crystal, it is a single dome. I believe it's just underneath because you really don't notice until you get to a very harsh angle and you can see a slight bit of distortion just at the edges of the crystal there. But the center of the crystal is still quite legible. You can see where the hand stack is, still quite readable. So for me, from what I can tell, is it looks like this is flat or slightly domed, but it looks like it's only on the one side there, whether it be under or over, tough to tell. I'm going to go ahead and say it's just a slightly domed and kind of leave it at that. Now, in terms of the bezel, it does have a 60-click unidirectional rotating bezel with an aluminum insert, and you do get that 12 o'clock lume pip. So let's get the action. That's one thing that titanium watches aren't really known for, is the bezel action. And I have to say this is not a standout from that perspective, but at the same time, it's not necessarily bad. It just feels just a little bit hollow and tinny by comparison to some other watches that are, you know, within semi within this category. And then also the fully polished bezel itself with the kind of shallow scallops there for grip don't necessarily inspire confidence from a functional and tactile engagement standpoint, although I think from a looks perspective absolutely do the job, and you know, it does fit the bill in terms of the aesthetic, so can't get too mad. Although you can't see it through this solid screw-in case back, you do get the Miyota 9051, which does have that nice smooth 4 hertz sweep, or 28,800 vibrations per hour. It's running at minus 10 to plus 20 seconds per day, but typically will run much better than that. Those are just the ultimate ranges there. And it does have a 42-hour power reserve, which isn't bad, especially considering that higher beat. Now, when we get to the dial, you do get a nice glossy blue dial. You get raised indices that do have those polished frames, which are nice. You're getting the date at 3 o'clock with black numerals over a silver disc, or a pale silver, which appears, I think, visually white. Let me give this a quick little wipe real quick there. And of course, the minutes hand is now obscuring that date window, but I think it's a nice little date window there, well executed. Nothing special. Again, this is really a throwback to those early divers, and it's not really meant to, I think, over romanticize them and make it into something that is, you know, as impressive, I think, as some of the offerings that Seiko's done kind of within a similar space, where they really try to key into some of that nostalgia and really take things up a notch. I think this one was more so about the specs, taking it up a notch by getting it in titanium and then also getting that higher beat movement in there, versus it being something where they really focused on taking up, let's say, the fit and finish and making that something to really jump out at you. I think the fit and finish is definitely a lot more kind of par for the course. You know, I guess you could call even some of the lines soft. You can see there's a contour here on that lug, not of high polished bevel or anything. It's just a very soft curvature, soft lines. So I mean, that's kind of is par for the course with this piece. The bracelet does have some soft contouring here. It doesn't even look like, even though it, yeah, visually it has the appearance of a 3-link bracelet, those are just single links that do have basically some etching to make it appear the shape of 3 links, which it does a fine enough job of, but again, it doesn't really go out of its way to look extra special or dive into some of the finer, more refined dive watches, again, that you might find with a similar aesthetic. Now, the Lume is Citizen's proprietary Lume that does glow green very nicely. In terms of the water resistance, it does have 20 bar or 200 meters of water resistance. It should be ISO compliant because it does have the text divers 200 meters on the dial, but I will say, as far as I know, to be ISO compliant, it should actually have the full index on the bezel insert for 60 minutes, which this doesn't have the individual. It just goes to the 15 minutes individual, and then the rest it's every 5. So I'm not an expert in terms of those ISO standards, but for me, it does confuse me a bit in terms of if it is fully ISO compliant or not, just based on that one aspect. I can't speak to any of the other testing that they would be providing, but Citizen is typically, you know, very mainstream, so they're held to a very high standard. So I would imagine that you know, this isn't a real big issue for them in terms of meeting that compliance. Now, in terms of the bracelet, you are getting 20 millimeter lugs, solid links and end links with a pin and collar system, and you do get a nice little taper just going from 20 millimeters to 18 millimeters down here at this nice ratcheting clasp. Great dive buckle, diver's extension. I wouldn't consider this a micro adjust tool. It's definitely meant to be a ratcheting diver's extension. So if you do have a wetsuit, you open it all the way, you clamp everything down, and then you just tighten it up to what feels best, and then you'll be good to go. I, of course, wouldn't want to use this as a manual micro just because it extends the the look and the feel of the clasp quite a bit if you do extend it, and generally it's quite unsightly. Even if you're just one click out, it visually does break down I think the look here a little bit. So again, I would definitely capitalize on getting your good sizing, because they do offer half links, and really just use this for a diver's extension like it's meant to be. Citizen does do a micro adjust, toolless micro adjust on some of their non-divers that would work perfectly fine if you do want to kind of swap that out and get something that's more micro adjust oriented. But with that said, let's actually get this piece on wrist and see how it wears. All right, guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this wears really well. Even if I get it up close to the camera here and you're gonna get some lens distortion, it might appear a little oversized. Because of that smaller dial to bezel ratio, it's still going to appear quite centered on the wrist. So what I'll do is I'll keep my hand nice and low and then just tighten the picture up just a bit here so you can get a closer look while still keeping a true aspect ratio of how this may appear on your own wrist. So it definitely does have a nice flow to it, very organic case shape, very, very comfortable. I'll say that's where this watch really excels, with that titanium construction in terms of the case and the bracelet. Very, very nice. Again, this fits great, and from a functional aspect, this is an amazing tool watch. So if you're looking for a tool watch, a dive watch to a very true rendition, this definitely checks a lot of those boxes. So and yeah, I mean, it is very good looking. The hype has kind of quelled around this watch, though. It's kind of died down. But I think that's because people's expectations weren't correctly aligned for the most part. I think a lot of people, again, were seeing this as some type of Seiko killer, when really, I don't think Citizen was necessarily trying to compete from that perspective, just because of the level of effort within the fit and finish and the actual overall execution of this, although the specs are very strong. And I do say this a lot in the comments section, is that I do not buy a spec sheet. I buy a watch that I want to wear, and at the end of the day, there's so many things that aren't listed on the spec sheet that do come into your overall wearing experience, as well as your own idea of a value proposition. So with that said, let's actually get this piece off the wrist, set up for some Lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. As you can see, very nice potent lume like you would expect from a Citizen diver or just a Citizen watch in general. They're really known, just like Seiko, for having nice, strong lume. So one thing I always do like to work in, of course, is some low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or maybe just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting, to maybe even include some harsh lighting that would normally expose any type of production defects here. But you can see this thing is super clean, especially with that nice hard coating. Although it does add a touch of cloudiness over that brushing, it does keep that brushing nicely intact in terms of its wear. And then, wow, the colors, I love the blues that they chose. And, even the texturing there, it's just a smooth, very simple, again, organic old school vibe you're getting, even though it is slightly modernized by the blue color palette. And I think that does tie in nicely to the titanium material, which is another step forward in terms of just being a little bit more modern. But you can see even in the mixed lighting there that bezel insert, although not fully loomed, is still quite visible in a lot of different situations, just because of the way that it's going to catch and reflect light. Check that out. So very, very nice, very, very handsome. I'll say where this really excels is how it feels on the wrist and how it looks on the wrist. This is a really good looking watch. All right, guys. So I think one thing that I forgot to mention was the crown. Some people have mentioned it is kind of small-ish. I will say that I agree, but it wasn't a hindrance in terms of using the crown, screwing it, unscrewing it was totally fine. And it actually does have quite a handsome signed crown in terms of the details. But overall, guys, on the wrist, this wears extremely well. That smaller dial really helps balance out the longer male end links on this watch. So I think the nice thing is that this is going to fit large wrists really well and small wrists really well. The smaller wrists will be pleasantly surprised by how small this wears visually just because of the smaller dial as well as that titanium construction. While somebody with a larger wrist, you're going to have a nice wrist presence still because of that wider center link on the bracelet as well as that male end link. Now, in terms of model variants, this is also available just on a rubber strap with the black dial. And then in terms of comparable models, I think Seiko will probably be the closest comparable in terms of in-house qualities. And while higher spec than the comparable Seiko, there's also a noticeably lower level of execution relating to fit and finish. So it's kind of a trade-off. You might get a bit of a taller spec sheet, but the overall product execution isn't quite as nice. So for me, guys, bottom line, it's still really nicely done. It's a great in-house diver from one of Japan's best. And, it's more, I'd consider it more of a solid alternative to something like the SPB 143 versus this kind of Seiko killer idea that, some enthusiasts might have originally hyped this release up to be. So again, I think in terms of the watch itself, it's great. It's serviceable, great tool watch, great dive watch. It does its job, very comfortable, very handsome. I think just when you compare it to some class-leading competition, it does get tough, and it depends on what you value in particular will kind of sway which one you prefer. So definitely look forward to another comparison video between this and, let's say, my SPB 143 / SBDC 101, just so you guys can get a side by side, and I'll point out some of those finer details and compare and contrast those for those of you that maybe haven't seen these two in the metal next to each other. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do hit like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.